Hello, my name is Rob Garner. I'm a computer programming instructor, and today I'm going to demonstrate how to use MVC routing and controllers. So I'm going to create a new project. It will be a C# web application. I'm going to call it MVC Routing Demo. And we're going to pick a empty template and MVC. Once the project starts up, notice that you have a controller folder, a model folder, and a view folder. So that's the MVC pattern that MVC implements. Or those are folders to hold the classes that use the MVC pattern. So under app start, we have a route config class. And this class allows us to define routes for our application. And you'll notice that you have a default route already mapped, and anything that comes into our server which is of this pattern, where you have a word for the control, a word for action, and a word for ID, will be routed to the controller named home, so home controller.cs. And by convention, what MVC does is it will add the word controller to the controller, and it'll look for the index method in the home controller.cs program. So right now we don't have any controllers defined, so this isn't actually going to anything yet, but we will add that at a later date. And let's see what happens when we run this as it is. And we get an error. Resource cannot be found. And let's try this. Let's put in home. Can't find home. Can't find index. And that's not surprising, because we don't have that defined yet. So we're going to right click on our controller, and we're going to add a controller. And we're going to pick an empty MVC controller. Since we're missing the home one, we're going to create home controller. And you can see that home controller is a fairly simple class. It inherits from controller class, and it has this action result method called index that just returns a view. I'm going to hit Control F5 again and see what happens. And we get this fairly elaborate error message. And it says the view index or its master was not found, or no view engine supports search locations. And what you'll notice is it actually looked in several places to find this view. It looked in the views folder, it looked in the home directory, and then it looked for something called index.aspx, ascx. It looked in shared views, which we don't have a folder for that yet. And it also looked for index.cshtml, vbhtml, and shared. So it will actually do a search through your directory structure to try to find this view. And this is part of what we call programming by convention. And the convention is that if you return this thing called view, it should reside in the views folder. Kind of makes sense. And it should reside in a view folder which is in a directory that has the same name as the controller, or this part here of the controller. And so you don't have to tell it specifically where this view is. It's going to assume it's in one of these folders. And if it doesn't find it, then you'll get an error. I'm going to right-click on View and go to Definition. And if we look at this method, we can see that what View does is it creates a view result object that renders a view to the response. So essentially, what MVC is doing is it's using the route config to get to process a request object. The request, it'll look at the request and look at the URL, and it will match it to this pattern. It'll then pass it to the controller. Presumably, if you put in home and then index, it would go look at the home controller and look for the index method to get the return result to display. That return view then would actually is the method that will go to the views folder, find the appropriate view, and then render it as a response object. And we see that this view method returns a view result object. So let's go to definition on view result. And view result we see is inherits from this thing called view result base. I'm going to go to definition on view result base, which inherits from action result. Aha, notice that this index method returns an action result. And so we can see that that view is actually producing the thing that should be returned from this method. And that thing, of course, has to be an action result because that's how the method was defined. Let's go to definition on action result. And we see that's the base class at the top end of this hierarchy. And it has an execute result method that takes a context and basically if you did the earlier exercises where we create an HTTP response off of a context object, and that's what was returned, this is ultimately where our response to a request is produced, is in this view method. So we can go use that view method. But another thing we could try to do just for now is, rather than returning view, we're going to just return a string and see what happens. And of course, I have to change this from action result to string. And we can see if we just return a string, it actually works just fine for just returning that string. So by default, if you just go to localhost, it's going to assume that you wanted home/index. And so that would be a fully qualified URL, and it's just going to get routed to the same place. So what this shows is that you can just return a string as opposed to an action result, and it will resolve it. You know, if we put HTML in here, it will process the HTML. So you can format, you could just be returning string objects. The other thing we could do is change this, and we're going to bring in a parameter into our method. And I'm just going to concatenate this into this string. I'm going to put these little dashes on either side so that we can see what the parameter is. And we see here we don't have a parameter. And what I need to do is say param. I have to look at the name here. It's param. So if I want this to display, I have to say param equals and one more thing, we have to say question mark. And now we see that if I say question mark and then put the name of a parameter, set it equal to something, it will actually come through the query string. So that question mark is needed for the query string. Which means that we can now create a response, and then construct from the parameter that's passed in what we wanted. And you could put multiple parameters in here. Possibly. Let's see if it works. Let's take a look at our code. And there we see that we can pass multiple parameters in. First item, second item, of course, you have to make sure that it's spelled correctly. So we could use that as a way of creating a function, and using the URL is essentially a function call. So in MVC, the URL is not really looking for a document, it's looking for a function. So let's add another action control result method, or another controller method. And this one will be a method for getting a greeting. And in this greeting method, we're going to return just hello plus name. And you'll notice that I've placed it inside of this HTML encode method. So what's the purpose of this HTML encode method? What it essentially does is it converts a string to an HTML encoded string. And the reason we do this is because whenever you get input from a user, as we would here through a HTTP request, it introduces the possibility of someone inserting script code inside of that request. And if you were to just return that script code as written, let's say that your web page was displayed to another group of users. What might happen here is someone might put in some script code to basically mock up, say, your password login routine, and convince other users using your system to type in their passwords to their server. Basically, this introduces a security vulnerability. The way we prevent the security and vulnerability as programmers is we ensure that anytime we get anything from entered into our system by a user, if we output it back out, we always use HTTP utility HTML encode to wrap that output to ensure that we don't get any script injection. So that's why we're doing this HTML encode. And if I run this, and I go to this new greeting page, and I say name equals let's see, did I build it? Oh, I forgot home. So it has to be home/greeting. If I just do that, it says hello. If I add in my parameter, it will say hello, Rob. So we can see that this works. Let's see what happens if we try to add a script tag. By default, the way .NET websites are made is they will actually look for script injection tags. So we actually don't even hit this HTML encode part before this is identified as a dangerous object because of the script tags. And if you look up the HTTP request validation exception class, it'll tell you that this exception is thrown when a potentially malicious input string is received from the client. So this is embedded basically in the .NET code to build a response. And you get this for free. You don't have to enable it. In fact, if you don't want it, you have to disable it. And you'd have to put in a system web. You have to go to the web config, and then in system.web, you would have to set request validation to false. So if I do that and then run this, you can see you actually have to kind of do a lot to make your code unsafe in .NET, or at least not comply with the normal measures that you would need. And it seems like it's still running. Let me try to and seems like I can't get this to turn off. So we're relatively safe from script injection. However, what I recommend is always putting in the HTML code just to make sure that if they do try to generate something, it'll render like this. And so, just to show you what this would look like if it did get through. you can see that what the HTML encode does is it takes this script tag and it just shows it. It doesn't actually process this as a script tag. If I inspect this element, I can see that what was actually rendered. Let's go to source. I think that'll work better. Oh. And you can see that the less than sign was rendered as an and LT. The greater than sign is an and great T. So what this all this HTML encode does is it takes the elements that would make these into HTML code and turns them into their escaped equivalents so that it just displays on the page. Now this works, using the query string works for getting inputs into a function, but it doesn't look very good. So it makes kind of ugly looking URLs. So there's another way we can bring information in. And what we're going to do is we're going to make another greeting method. And I'm going to delete this test code here to test our HTML code. We're just going to make a second version of this. We're going to call it greeting2. And rather than string, I'm going to say string name. We're going to say string ID. And we'll say hello plus ID. And what this ID corresponds to is, if you noticed in the route config, we had this third element that had the name ID, and it's normally used as an index parameter. But in our case, we're just going to use it to bring in a parameter and see what happens. If I run this now, and we'll call greeting2, and instead of saying name equals Rob, I'm just going to put in /Rob. So now this is a nice looking URL. It's just a number of elements separated by a slash, and you can see that this works and returns hello Rob. And we didn't want view source, we just wanted to do that. So this is another way, rather than using the query string with this question mark, now we can just put in a slash. And the key for that to work is that the parameter name has to be the same name as this name here in the route config. Now let's say that we wanted to have a method that brought in multiple parameters. And so we will then call this method home/add/5/4. And it says it can't find this. Not surprising, it doesn't know what, it can find add, but it can't find and forward go into ID, but it can't find this next one. And since it went to ID, X and Y are not defined in this function because 4 would go into ID and it doesn't know what to do with 5. So what we have to do is go to our route config and we have to add another route. So we're going to, in this in this register routes method, we're going to add a call to map route. And we have to set these parameters. So name, and we're using named parameters to basically call the map route function. And we're going to call this one multiple parameters. Its URL, we're going to construct it just like the other one. So we'll get a controller, we'll get an action, an X and a Y. And you can name those what you want, but when you define this defaults property, then you need to we'll just find an anonymous class here to define it, and we're just going to say controller is going to equal home. So notice that these parameters in this anonymous class have to match what you defined here. Home, and then action equals index and then X and Y will just be whatever comes up after that. So I'll save this and we'll run it again with Control F5. And we can see that now 4 and 5 went to X and Y. If we go to my home controller, we can see that they're mapped into the parameters X and Y as a result. And then we got our sum. So that's how you can add a route config in order to bring values in with different parameter names and different patterns. So next, let's do this. Let's create a controller action or a controller method. And we're going to return, and we're going to use this content method. If we look at the content method, creates a content result object by using a string. So before we were returning integers and strings. If we want to, normally though, we want our controller methods to return action results. We can do that by using this content method. And there's several overrides. You can just have just a string. You can have one which sets the content type. And so we're going to make this just return plain text. And now we'll go to home, which is the name of my controller again. and we'll go to content demo, which is the name of the method. And we can see that it does in fact return a this string as an action result. Another thing we could return is JavaScript. This won't generate that same error we had when we were testing script injection, because this is coming from the server, not from input from the user. And again, we put the name of the controller, which is home, and then the name of the action control result. And I think we have an error in our, well, so if I do this JavaScript demo, it just displays the results. I think there must have been some change in version, because I can get this to run if I do it as a content, and rather than defining a function, I just execute that function. And we can see here now it's actually executing this script. So if you want to do JavaScript and have it execute, use content rather than JavaScript. Let's do a demo on JSON. So if I'm going to add another action result. Okay, so I'm going to define this anonymous class for M. We're going to make it a object that we return from using JSON. And let's see what this one does. So again, it's going to go to the home controller. This time it's going to go to JSON demo. And you can see we get a JSON object returned using this. So this is a way of essentially making a data service and returning information. You could actually replace this with database code that would grab the information and return it. You can also use the redirect command. So if you want a URL to go somewhere else, so for example, I'm going to make another action result called redirect demo. And you just call redirect. Provide the URL where you want it to go. This could be another page on your site or on another site. In this case, I'm just going to go to CNM's website. If I go to this redirect demo, it redirects me to CNM. If I wanted to go to a different MVC site, what I could do is just return a route and do redirect to route. And just specify the controller and the action. I'm just going to go to this content demo that we created. And of course you have to spell things correctly. And you can see that this redirects to a different controller. We can even return images. I'm going to add a folder. I'm going to call it images. And just drag in an image. And we'll And actually what we're going to do is we're just going to return a file and just return this image. If you want a relative reference, in this instance we can use a tilde. And then select the content type. In this case, we're going to send it back as an image.jpg. You could return it, depending on what type of file, you could return it as whatever file it was. Let's see how this works. And it returns this image. So that demonstrates a number of ways we can use controllers in the route. So we first demonstrated how to use the default route that you get when you create an MVC site. We also created a custom route which returned which allowed us to use multiple parameters in the URL. We then saw that we make a controller and just add multiple controller methods, and that when you go to a MVC site, really the first element is the domain, then comes the controller by convention. The next one is controller, and then the next one is the action result. And then if you had, for example, if we were going to use this add method, we put the method name and then whatever parameters, and it will pass those parameters into the appropriate blocks as long as your route is defined in order to enable that. So that completes my demonstration of MVC and routes and controllers. Thank you.